It's 1 p.m. in Los Angeles. It's 4 p.m. in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday, the 22nd of February, 2012. I'm Mark Strassman, reporter with Utopia News. I'm about to talk to Karlyn Bowman, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she studies public opinion, and she's going to talk about it with us today on Utopia News. Welcome, Karlyn, to Utopia News.
I'm delighted to be with you.
I understood it to be conventional wisdom that most Americans thought Congress was doing a bad job, but they liked their own representative. Apparently there's been some change in that. What have you found?
Well, the numbers that we're seeing on Congress now are some of the most negative I've ever seen in many, many years of looking at public opinion. Right now, about 3/4 of Americans are saying that most members of Congress do not deserve re-election. That's the highest in 19 years that Gallup's been asking that question. They're a little bit more positive about their own member, but a number of survey questions, for example, one from NBC News and the Wall Street Journal, suggests that most Americans would get rid of them all, including their own member of Congress. So views are very, very negative about the institution.
Is it self-evident why this is true, or did the pollsters ask in more depth why people feel this way?
Pollsters don't Congress very often, so we don't question about people speaking in their own words about what they think is wrong, but they see gridlock, they see deep partisanship, and I think those are some of the things that Americans don't like. It's interesting to contrast an institution like Congress that has myriad responsibilities with an institution like the military, which is the most highly regarded institution in American life. Their mission is very narrowly and clearly defined, whereas Congress has a diffuse mission, lots to do. There's a great deal to criticize, and the public is very vocal about that criticism.
Does this mean that a lot of incumbents are likely to lose their seats this coming election?
I think we could see some real surprises in terms of incumbent losses. As you know, most incumbents who seek re-election are re-elected. That number is above 90%. It's a little lower than it was 5 or 10 years ago, but still it's a very high number overall. So I think we'll see a lot of surprises this fall. You have about the same number of retirements at this point in the cycle that you did 2 years ago. But you have a number of Democrats facing other Democrats. You have a number of Republicans facing other Republicans because of redistricting. So I think we're going to see a lot of surprises in November, if not before.
Okay, so the Congress isn't very popular. How's President Obama doing?
President Obama's doing better. People are seeing some improvement in the economy, so his approval rating is very close to 50%. In most polls, it's ticked up a percentage point or two. And how a president's doing in March of an election year, at the end of March, if he's at about the 50% mark, it's usually a pretty good sign that he will be reelected. So Obama's numbers have been going up by small degrees.
Okay, given what you said about people's opinion of Congress and their increasingly positive view of the president, is it a good strategy for him to run against Congress and call it a do-nothing Congress and try?
It's a good strategy.
To do that?
Yes, it's a definitely good strategy for him to run against Congress. I'm not sure how Democratic incumbents will feel about that because, of course, he's got to be very careful in his criticisms, and he has been. He's been talking about the obstructionism of the Republicans in Congress overall, but I think there are a lot of Democrats in Congress who worry that they'll be painted with the same brush.
Now, switching to the campaign for the Republican nomination, you've found that Mitt Romney was seen as more conservative in 2008 than he's being seen now. Is that because of the competition he's against?
I think part of it is the competition he's against. If we remember, he was the conservative alternative to John McCain 4 years ago. That's certainly not the case today. He's seen as the most moderate of the candidates. And in one of the polls, one of the new polls, only 36% said that his policies would be very different from the policies of Barack Obama, 36% of Republicans, and that's a dangerous number, whereas more than 50% said that Newt Gingrich's and Rick Santorum's views would be very different from Barack Obama. So you get the sense that a lot of Republicans don't think that Mitt Romney is conservative enough. It's a very conservative Republican Party.
Have you been seeing recent findings about Rick Santorum and his emphasis on religion and how that's been perceived by both the Republican base and by independents and others?
Republicans seem to like Rick Santorum. He's soaring in the polls of Republican primary voters, perhaps because they're a little tepid about Mitt Romney. He's leading the pack in the Gallup poll and in several other fairly new polls that we have. I think people are just getting to know Rick Santorum, and tonight, of course, they'll be able to watch the debate and get a better understanding of who he is. But we really haven't had any polling questions on the way that Rick Santorum talks about his religion at this point.
Speaking of polling as such, do you feel that the polling establishment does a good job at highlighting the questions that are really important and getting answers to them in a timely way?
I think the polling profession does try to do a very good job. I think they're too closely tied to the modern media, therefore they're following whatever story happens to be hot, and we're losing some of the really important trend questions that pollsters have asked over the years. But for the most part, I think the major pollsters whose names that your listeners and viewers will know try to do a very good job at what they do. They try to stay close enough to the news and to ask questions in a very fair way. And most of them post their findings on the internet, on their websites, and so you can get a sense of how they've asked the questions, the order in which they've asked the questions, and so they're pretty transparent about what they do.
Does polling have an impact of its own on the process? Do people look to the polls to see who they're supposed to be liking and then start liking them?
Well, it's hard in this country. We're so vast, we're so diverse, heterogeneous, that you don't see much evidence of a bandwagon effect for people following the polls. But in a country like Britain, where you have a very short 6-week election campaign, there's a lot of evidence of tactical voting, of voting based on where certain candidates are in the polls overall. But we just don't see that in the United States.
Okay. Where are people getting their news now, and what kind of trends are emerging in that area?
Well, one of the big changes that we've seen recently is most people are getting their news or learning something about the campaign from cable. Television is still the main medium that we listen to. When you ask people about where they're learning about the campaign, cable news is the primary source. And, of course, the number of people who are learning about the campaign through the internet has gone up very substantially, whereas newspaper readership, national networks, those have all either declined or stayed about the same in the last several campaigns.
Does the amount of information that people are getting about the campaigns and the election increasing, or are people tuning out, or are they tuning in?
Well, Republicans say they've been pretty interested in the campaign thus far, and they seem to be paying attention. It's not clear that we have a lot of factual information about the candidates or about the campaign. Americans tend to make their judgments about politics in terms of their values first, and then they incorporate the information that they learn about the candidates themselves. But campaign news is still pretty popular.
Is it what people hear on the news or what they see in the advertisements that more influences their vote?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. Certainly in some of these states where people have absolutely been inundated with television advertising, in Florida, for example, where they have some big media markets and people saw thousands of commercials before the Florida primary, those probably had a very important impact on the race overall. But nationally, at this point at least, we don't have many political advertisements overall.
Okay.
But both Romney's going to be spending a lot of money and time advertising in Michigan because he has that kind of money. Santorum and Gingrich will be spending a little less. They don't have the resources or the cash on hand that Romney does.
Okay. You've also been looking at what's happening with immigration, and apparently the voters have a more nuanced view of this than the candidates. What have you found in that area?
Well, that's certainly true. Americans are willing, if illegal immigrants meet certain conditions, to put them on a path to citizenship overall. That's not some of the rhetoric that we hear from politics all the time. They believe that if someone comes here with parents as a young child, that person ought to be entitled to U.S. citizenship overall. That's, of course, what the Constitution says. So I think, too, that we've seen, for example, in the Florida electorate, the exit pollsters asked the same question that they'd asked 4 years ago, and views seemed a little bit less intense or less opposed to, or less likely to have a harsh view about immigration overall.
Okay, I'd just like you to wrap up by giving us any kind of observations you have about the current state of the system that evaluates people's opinions and what role it's playing in the process right now.
Yeah. Polls, I think, have had a very dramatic impact on the campaign. As Gallup reported Just recently, the lead changed 11 times in the Gallup poll in 2011. It's already changed 4 times in 2012, and so people are paying attention to the polls about who's ahead. At this time, the national polls seem like a bit of a lagging indicator overall, but the state polls in Arizona and Michigan, for example, the things that we're watching most closely this week, seem to do a pretty good job of capturing the race. Most of the major ones do, that is.
Okay, good. I want to thank you for doing the observations that you do and for talking to us about them today on Utopia News.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.